In 2003, a regular checkup for kids skipping school in the countryside of Kentucky led helpers to a discovery so shocking that it made them question everything they thought they knew about how awful people can be and how scary messed up genes can get. What they found hidden in a faraway place wasn't just a case of kids not going to school or being poor. It was proof of the most strange family setup ever found in American history, where two sisters had spent 8 years having babies with each other's husbands, who were also their own brothers. The 12 children living in this bad dream weren't just hurt, they were the result of a huge gene problem that was so planned and so extreme that it went against nature itself. This is the story of Sarah and Mary Beth Coleman, sisters who made marrying family members a family tradition and created a family line so broken that scientists could barely explain how their children stayed alive. Before we get into the story, click the like button and follow the channel so you never miss the darkest stories hidden right in front of us. And after you've followed, write in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Together we are building a group of night watchers who face these scary stories side by side, no matter how far apart we are. Now let's keep going with the story. The morning of October 15, 2003 started like any other for helper Jennifer Hayes. She was driving through the back roads of Harlan County, Kentucky, checking up on a report about kids who hadn't been seen in school for over 2 years. The address led her down smaller and smaller dirt roads until she reached a place that seemed stuck in old times. What she found there would bother her for the rest of her job. The property had one big wooden building that was barely a house, surrounded by makeshift sheds and trash that made it seem like the people living there were completely cut off from modern life. But it wasn't the old-fashioned living conditions that made Hayes call for help. It was the children she met when she knocked on the door. 12 kids, from toddlers to teenagers, answered her knock, and every single one showed clear signs of serious gene damage. Their faces were marked by the obvious signs of family members having children together. Big foreheads, misshapen jaws, and eyes that didn't quite look right. Some could barely talk even though they were old enough for school. Others walked with shaky steps like people whose bodies had never grown correctly. Hayes had seen poverty and neglect before, but this was something totally different. This was a huge body problem that seemed to come from many years of gene messing around. When 4 grown-ups finally came out of the house, Hayes realized she was looking at 2 couples who looked so much alike that they could only be siblings. The men, James and Daniel Coleman, seemed to be in their early 30s, but walked with the slow, careful steps of people much older. The women, Sarah and Mary Beth Coleman, looked tired from years of being pregnant and giving birth. All 4 grown-ups showed the same gene problems as the children, but less severely. Their faces showed small but clear signs of family members having children together that had been building up in their family for many years. What made Hayes call for help right away wasn't just the clear gene damage, it was the way the family acted with each other. The children called both men daddy and both women mama, without really understanding what normal family relationships are. The grown-ups to each other in a close way that suggested their relationships were much more complicated than just simple marriage. And when Hayes asked about the children's fathers, she got answers that made her feel scared. Each child was said to have multiple parents in ways that broke every rule of normal human reproduction. As more helpers and police came to the scene, they started to put together a family setup so messed up that it made it hard for them to understand what they were seeing. This wasn't just a case of being poor or having extreme religious beliefs. This was proof of planned gene messing around that had been going on for almost 10 years, creating a family line so damaged that the children were living proof of what happens when people treat having babies like a science experiment done without understanding the results. As helpers looked deeper into their investigation, they found a family setup so twisted and intentionally made that it went against every rule of normal human relationships and gene health. Sarah Coleman had married her brother James in 1995 when she was 20 years old and he was 22. Just 2 years later, their sister Mary Beth married their other brother Daniel in what the family called a double blessing that would keep their family line pure and strong. But these weren't regular marriages in any way that normal society would understand. Within months of the second wedding, both couples had set up a system where the wives were regularly shared between both husbands. creating a way of having babies that turned a gene disaster into a planned family practice. The investigation showed that Sarah and Mary Beth had made what they called the rotation, where each woman would spend every other month living as wife to both brothers. During Sarah's month with James, Mary Beth would live with Daniel, but the next month, they would switch partners completely. This wasn't just sometimes cheating or being confused about relationships. This was a planned system made to make sure that both women stayed pregnant all the time by both men, making the most of what the family believed was pure genes while actually creating the most extreme gene problem ever found in American family history. The children born from this setup didn't clearly understand which man was their real father because DNA testing was not allowed in the house as messing with God's plan. Brothers were also cousins. Sisters were also half-sisters through different father-uncle mixes, and family relationships had become so mixed up that even the grown-ups couldn't always explain how the children were related to each other. Helper Jennifer Hayes found that the family kept careful charts tracking which woman was with which man during the times when babies were made. But these records were written in a secret code that mixed religious words with shortcuts that made them almost impossible to understand. What became clear was that both Sarah and Mary Beth had been pregnant almost all the time since they got married, having 12 children in 8 years, while having sex with both brothers for most of their pregnancies. The gene problems from this planned marrying of family members were immediately clear in every child. Each new baby had more serious problems as the family's already weak genes became more and more concentrated. The oldest children showed fairly small signs of gene damage, but the youngest showed huge growth problems that suggested the family's way of having babies was reaching the very limits of what a human body could survive. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the gene doctor called in to check on the family, said their way of having babies was the most extreme case of planned gene concentration she had ever seen, outside of lab experiments made to study the effects of family members having children together on animal populations. The family had basically turned themselves into a closed system for having babies, where gene differences had been removed so completely that good genes had no chance of surviving, while bad changes were made bigger with each new generation. What made the situation even more upsetting was the discovery that this wasn't because of not knowing or by accident. The family had purposely chosen this way of having babies based on their understanding of religious teachings about keeping family lines pure. They saw their gene isolation as a holy duty, and the problems in their children as tests of faith instead of results of body rules. The grown-ups explained to investigators that sharing wives between brothers was done in old Bible times, and that their children's problems were proof of their special status as chosen people who had been marked by God for a higher purpose. This religious reason had allowed them to keep doing their harmful baby-making practices, even as each new birth brought clearer proof that they were creating a gene disaster instead of pure genes. The messed-up family setup that helpers found in 2003 didn't happen by accident or by slowly being cut off. It was the planned creation of William Coleman, a very religious person who had spent many years planning and doing what he believed was God's design for a pure family line. William had moved his family to the country in Harlan County in 1976 when his children were still young, buying 50 acres of remote mountain land where he could raise his children according to his own understanding of Bible teachings about gene purity and family loyalty. William was a man obsessed with Old Testament stories about family leaders who married within their families to keep chosen family lines going. He spent hours studying parts about Abraham marrying his half-sister Sarah, Isaac marrying his cousin Rebekah, and Jacob taking sisters as wives. But William's understanding went much further than even the most strict religious scholars would accept. He believed that modern Christianity had been ruined by outside influences, and that true believers were called to go back to the practices of Bible times, including marriage between close relatives to bring God's blessings into pure family lines. By the early 1980s, William had started preparing his children for what he called the sacred plan. James, Daniel, Sarah, and Mary Beth were taught at home using lessons that William created himself, focusing a lot on religious lessons that stressed family loyalty above all other values. The children were taught that outsiders were tainted by sin, and that marrying within the family was not just okay, but required by God to keep their special status as chosen people. William's plan became clearer as his children reached their teenage years in the late 1980s. He arranged the marriages between his sons and daughters, but added a key part that even old Bible rules about having multiple wives hadn't included. He set up what he called the sharing agreement, where wives would be swapped between brothers to make sure the genes were as concentrated as possible and prevent any child from having only one male parent within the family line. William explained this system by saying that since his sons were brothers by blood and faith, sharing wives would double the blessing on each child and create children who carried the genes of multiple family leaders within the same generation. The religious rules that William created for his plan were complex and made sense to him, even though it broke every rule of genes and social structure. He taught his children that each pregnancy from the sharing system was a holy act that brought God's chosen genes together while getting rid of the badness that came from outside family lines. He convinced them that the problems appearing in their children were actually signs of God's favor, marking them as different from normal humans and closer to the angels described in Bible visions. William's control over his children was complete because he had kept them separate from birth and controlled every part of their education and how they saw the world. They had no idea what normal family relationships were like, or that their father's teachings represented a very different way from accepted religious practice. By the time they grew up, James, Daniel, Sarah, and Mary Beth truly believed that their marriages to family members and shared baby-making arrangements were acts of religious devotion that would earn them special favor after death. The compound that William built showed his worried way of thinking and his strong desire to prevent outside interference. He built hidden rooms, kept close watch on the edges of the property, and set up rules for dealing with visitors that focused on secrecy and tricking people. William died in 1998, but his children kept following his plan with religious dedication, seeing their father's teachings as holy rules that must be followed no matter what happened to their children. The gene disaster that happened over the next 5 years was the direct result of William's planned manipulation of his children's beliefs and his planned destruction of their ability to know the difference between religious devotion and a huge body problem. The planned training of William Coleman's children began when they were barely old enough to understand the idea of marriage. But it sped up a lot during their teenage years in the 1990s, when their father's messed up idea started to become real. James, born in 1973, Daniel in 1975, Sarah in 1975, and Mary Beth in 1977, had spent their whole childhoods cut off from the outside world, and taught William's understanding of Bible family structure. By the time they reached their teenage years, they didn't understand that their father's teachings represented extreme deviation from normal human relationships. The children's education had been carefully made to make marrying family members seem normal through always being told Old Testament stories without the history and culture that regular religious education provided. William taught them that Abraham's marriage to his half-sister was the example for all holy unions, that Isaac's planned marriage to his cousin showed God's approval of family members marrying each other, and that Jacob's relationships with the sisters Rachel and Leah proved that sharing spouses between family members was blessed by God. By the time James turned 18 in 1991, he had been taught to see marriage to his sister Sarah as his religious destiny instead of breaking a natural rule. The first wedding happened in 1995 when Sarah turned 20 and James was 22. William performed the ceremony himself, using a mix of Bible passages and his own religious ideas that made the marriage seem like a holy act of gene cleaning. The ceremony was only attended by close family members and included promises that tied the couple not just to each other, but to the bigger family plan that would require Sarah to have children by multiple male relatives. Sarah's first pregnancy in 1996 produced a son who showed small but clear signs of gene damage. The baby had a slightly large head, slow body growth, and learning problems that became clear as he got older. But instead of seeing these warning signs of gene problems, the family saw them as proof that the child was special and marked by God for a higher purpose. The success of the first marriage and having children, no matter their gene condition, encouraged William to continue with the second part of his plan. Daniel married Beth in 1997 in another private ceremony that focused on family loyalty and gene concentration over regular marriage promises. Mary Beth's first pregnancy later that year produced a daughter whose gene problems were more clear than her older cousins, including very bad speech delays and movement problems that needed constant supervision. By 1998, both couples had had multiple children, and William had started the sharing system that would define the family's baby-making strategy for the next 10 years. The brothers were taught that sharing their wives was an act of spiritual brotherhood that doubled the blessing on each child and made sure that the family's gene heritage would be concentrated instead of watered down. The wives were taught to see the arrangement as their holy duty and a privilege that allowed them to serve multiple family leaders within the same household. The early years of the sharing system produced children with more and more serious gene damage. But the family's isolation and religious teaching kept them from understanding the connection between their baby-making practices and their children's problems. Each new birth was celebrated as proof of God's favor, while the growing medical problems were blamed on spiritual tests that showed the family's special status as chosen people. The children born during this time would grow up never knowing normal family relationships, never understanding that their parents were also their aunts and uncles, and never learning that their severe learning problems and physical problems were the expected result of many years of gene concentration instead of God's blessing. By 2000, the first generation of William's plan had produced 8 children, whose combined medical problems were a list of gene disasters. But the family remained sure that they were doing God's will and creating a pure family line that would inherit special spiritual gifts not given to the tainted outside world. Between 1995 and 2003, Sarah and Mary Beth Coleman produced 12 children whose birth records read like a medical textbook on the terrible effects of planned family member breeding. Each pregnancy was carefully planned and coordinated between the sisters who had developed a complex system of shared care that made sure both women stayed pregnant almost all the time throughout their years of having children. The family saw this constant cycle of pregnancy and birth as proof of God's blessing, but medical experts would later describe it as one of the most extreme examples of planned gene manipulation ever found in American family history. The first child born to Sarah and James in 1996 showed fairly small signs of gene damage. Michael had a slightly large head and mild delays in growing, but the family saw these as signs of special intelligence instead of gene problems. The second child, born to Mary Beth and Daniel 6 months later, showed more clear problems, including very bad speech delays and movement problems that needed constant supervision. But instead of seeing a pattern, the family celebrated each birth as proof that their gene concentration was producing children marked by God for special purposes. By 1998, both sisters had established what they called the pregnancy agreement, where they planned their cycles to make sure that one woman was always in the early stages of pregnancy, while the other was giving birth or recovering. This system was made to get the most gene concentration by making sure that children were born as close together as possible, while keeping the sharing arrangement between both brothers. The sisters tracked their ovulation cycles using charts that combined religious symbols with signs of fertility, treating making a baby as a holy science that needed exact timing and spiritual preparation. The middle years of the birth pattern produced children with more and more serious problems. The fifth child, born in 1999, had such severe brain problems that he never learned to speak beyond simple grunts and hand motions. The seventh child, born in 2000, showed body deformities, including a misshapen spine and limbs that grew wrongly because of gene changes that had built up in the family's DNA over many years of family member breeding. Each new birth brought clearer proof of gene collapse, but the family's religious teaching kept them from making the connection between their baby-making practices and their children's problems. Sarah and Mary Beth had developed a complex support system for managing multiple pregnancies and caring for disabled children at the same time. They shared all child-raising duties without caring about who the real parents were, creating a household where every grown-up was responsible for every child, and where regular parent-child bonds were replaced by shared care arrangements. The sisters often nursed each other's babies and made medical decisions together, treating the 12 children as products of a shared baby-making effort instead of separate families. The later children born after 2000 showed gene damage so serious that their survival amazed medical experts who later examined them. The 10th child suffered from multiple organ problems that needed constant medical attention the family couldn't provide. The 11th child was born with such severe brain problems that she remained in a coma-like state throughout her short life. The 12th and final child, born in 2003, just months before the discovery, showed the most extreme gene problems yet seen in the Coleman family line, including a huge head and problems with internal organs that would prove deadly within the first year of life. Despite the clearer and clearer proof that their baby-making system was causing a gene disaster, the family remained sure that each birth fulfilled God's plan for concentrated family lines. They understood their children's problems as proof of God's choice instead of body results. And they continued their baby-making practices even as the gene damage reached levels that threatened the survival of future children. The birth pattern that emerged over 8 years represented planned gene manipulation, done without any understanding of the scientific rules involved, creating a family line so damaged that medical experts would later struggle to explain how many of the children had survived the process of growing inside the mother. The sisters' dedication to their baby-making agreement had created what gene doctors would describe as a controlled experiment in human family member breeding problems, done on a scale and with a level of planned work that challenged basic ideas about the limits of gene damage that a human could survive. Daily life in the Coleman compound followed a strict schedule that revolved around the family's messed-up understanding of Bible household management and their planned baby-making practices. The main house was a big wooden building that William had made bigger many times over the years to fit his growing idea of a family compound with many generations. The house had 6 bedrooms arranged in a way that made the sharing arrangements between the two couples easier, with James and Daniel having separate main bedrooms while Sarah and Mary Beth moved between them, according to the monthly rotation schedule that governed their baby-making duties. The children slept in shared dorm-style rooms divided by gender instead of family relationships. Since regular parent-child bonds had been purposely removed in favor of shared child-raising arrangements, every part of daily routine was controlled by religious rituals that made the family believe more in their special status as chosen people, following God's original plan for pure family lines. Morning prayers included specific thanks for the concentration of God's genes within their family, and requests for continued fertility to produce more children marked by God's favor. Meals were shared events where the grown-ups took turns reading from William's handwritten religious texts that explained their practices through chosen Bible quotes and complex religious arguments that showed marrying family members as a holy duty instead of breaking a natural rule. The family's isolation was maintained through careful checking of all outside contact and planned teaching that showed the outside world as tainted by sin and gene corruption. The children were taught that people outside their family were spiritually and biologically weaker, infected by many years of mixing with unclean family lines that had made their connection to God's original creation less strong. Television, radio, and outside reading materials were strictly forbidden to prevent them from hearing ideas that might challenge their understanding of normal family relationships, the few times that government officials or neighbors came near the compound. The family had practiced answers that avoided questions about their living arrangements and showed a false front of regular religious practice. The sexual arrangements that controlled the grown-ups' relationships were presented to the children as proof of their family's advanced spiritual development and closer resemblance to the practice of having multiple wives by Bible family leaders. Sarah and Mary Beth were taught to see their shared baby-making duties as a form of religious service that showed their devotion to God's plan for concentrated genes. The monthly rotation between husbands was made into a ritual through prayer ceremonies that blessed each change and made the exchange seem like a holy act that doubled the spiritual power flowing through their children. The children grew up believing that their family structure was not just normal, but better than the messed-up arrangements they might see in the outside world. The household's economy was completely self-sufficient by design, with the family growing their own food, making their own clothing, and avoiding all outside jobs that might expose them to bad influences. William had established this isolation as essential to keeping the purity of their family line and preventing outside interference with God's plan for their gene concentration. The children were given work responsibilities from a young age, but their clear problems meant that even simple tasks needed constant supervision and help from the grown-ups. Education within the compound focused only on religious lessons that stressed their understanding of family loyalty and gene purity, as God's rules. The children learned to read using only Bible texts and William's religious writings, keeping them from getting information that might help them understand how strange their situation was. Math and science were taught only as they related to Bible numbers and creation stories, making sure that the children never learned about gene rules that might explain their problems or challenge their family's practices. The family's medical care was all done by themselves using prayer and plant remedies that William believed were enough for treating any health problems that came up in their blessed family line. Seeing doctors was seen as proof of not enough faith and possible exposure to outside authorities who might not understand their religious practices. This isolation from medical care meant that the children's gene problems went undiagnosed and untreated, allowing their problems to get worse over time, while making the family believe more that their suffering was proof of God's testing instead of body results of planned family member breeding. When helpers first met the 12 Coleman children in 2003, they were seeing the terrible human cost of 8 years of planned gene manipulation. Each child showed a unique mix of problems that together formed a complete list of what happens when human genes are pushed beyond what a body can survive. The oldest child, Michael, born in 1996, showed fairly mild problems compared to his younger brothers and sisters. He had learning problems that kept him from reading past a second grade level, even though he was 7 years old. His speech was unclear and hard to understand. His movement problems made simple tasks like tying shoes or writing almost impossible. But compared to what would come later, Michael's condition seemed almost normal. The second child, born 6 months after Michael, showed more serious delays in growing. She couldn't speak in full sentences, even though she was nearly 7 years old. Her body movements were so bad that she needed help with basic things like eating and getting dressed. She showed signs of autism-like behaviors, including rocking back and forth and being unable to make eye contact with strangers. The family saw her quiet behavior as proof of special spiritual sensitivity instead of brain damage. By the time the fourth and fifth children were born in 1998 and 1999, the gene damage had gotten so bad that it would have made any normal family seek immediate medical help. The fourth child suffered from very bad mental problems that left him acting like a toddler even though he was 4 years old. He had never learned to use the toilet by himself and communicated only through simple grunts and pointing. The fifth child's condition was even more devastating. Born with microcephaly, his head was much smaller than normal, and his brain development had been very damaged. He had frequent seizures that the family treated with prayer instead of medical help. His thinking abilities were so limited that he didn't recognize family members and needed constant supervision to keep him from hurting himself. The middle children, born between 2000 and 2001, were at the point where gene collapse started to threaten basic survival. The seventh child was born with spina bifida, a condition where the spine doesn't grow properly, leaving her partly paralyzed from the waist down. The family had made a simple wheelchair from wood and metal parts, but she received no physical therapy or medical treatment that might have improved her ability to move. The eighth child suffered from multiple heart problems from birth that caused breathing difficulties and limited his ability to do any physical activity. His lips and fingernails showed a blue tint that meant poor oxygen in his blood, a condition that would have needed immediate surgery in any hospital. The family blamed his breathing problems on spiritual sensitivity and believed that his weakness was proof of a pure soul too delicate for the physical world. The youngest children born after 2002 showed gene damage so severe that their survival seemed almost like a miracle to medical experts who later examined them. The 10th child was born with severe clubfoot problems that left both feet twisted at impossible angles. She could only move by crawling or being carried by family members. The 11th child suffered from very deep mental problems, combined with body deformities that included misshapen hands with webbed fingers and a cleft palate that made eating and speaking extremely difficult. The 12th and final child, born just months before the family's discovery, showed the most extreme gene problems yet seen in the Coleman family line. His head was horribly enlarged because of hydrocephalus, a condition where fluid builds up in the brain. His internal organs showed multiple problems that made normal digestion and breathing nearly impossible. He needed constant care and showed no signs of brain development beyond the most basic reflexes. Throughout this progression of gene disaster, The family held on to their belief that each child's problems were proof of God's favor instead of body results. They made complex religious explanations for every condition, seeing seizures as moments of God talking to them, physical deformities as marks of spiritual selection, and mental problems as proof of souls too pure for earthly concerns. The family's complete avoidance of medical care meant that conditions that might have been treatable were allowed to get worse while the children suffered without pain relief or therapy. This medical neglect was presented to the children as proof of their family's superior faith and rejection of worldly solutions to spiritual challenges, making sure that even the older children who could understand their situation learned to see their suffering as proof of God's special attention instead of a preventable tragedy. Within 48 hours of Jennifer Hayes's first discovery, the Coleman compound had become the center of the largest child welfare investigation in Kentucky state history. Child Services Director Robert Manning put together a team that included gene counselors, child psychologists, police specialists, and medical experts who had experience with cases involving planned abuse and neglect, but nothing in their training had prepared them for the complex mix of gene manipulation and religious extremism that they encountered when they began formal interviews with the Coleman family members. The first challenge investigators faced was the family's complete inability to understand why their lifestyle was a problem. James and Daniel Coleman answered questions with genuine confusion about why authorities were interested in their religious practices. They explained their marriage arrangements using Bible quotes and religious arguments that presented marrying family members as proof of spiritual advancement instead of criminal behavior. When asked about the sharing system between wives, they described it as a holy agreement that maximized God's blessing on their children while showing their commitment to family unity over individual desires. Sarah and Mary Beth proved even more difficult to interview because their training had been so complete that they truly believed their baby-making arrangements were proof of God's favor. They spoke about their shared pregnancies and coordinated child-raising as proof of their special status as chosen women who had been selected to concentrate God's genes within a pure family line. When investigators pointed out the clear gene damage in their children, both women became defensive and insisted that the problems were signs of spiritual selection instead of body results of family member breeding. The children presented the most heartbreaking challenge for investigators because their severe problems and complete isolation had left them unable to understand normal family relationships or recognize their situation as abnormal. The older children who could communicate at all spoke about their family structure as the only reality they had ever known. They described their parents' sharing arrangements as if it were normal and showed no awareness that other families operated differently. When asked about their own health problems, they repeated the religious explanations they had been taught, describing their seizures as moments of God talking to them and their physical deformities as marks of God's special attention. Gathering physical evidence proved equally challenging because the family had operated in complete isolation for many years, without creating the paper records that typically documented abuse cases. There were no medical records because the family had avoided all professional health care. There were no school records because the children had never been enrolled in educational programs. There were no financial records that might have revealed suspicious patterns because the family was entirely self-sufficient. Investigators had to rely primarily on physical evidence of gene damage and testimony from family members who had been taught to see their situation as religiously mandated instead of criminally abusive. The legal framework for prosecuting the case was complicated by the fact that Kentucky's incest laws had been written to address individual cases of sexual abuse rather than planned breeding programs conducted under religious justification. Prosecutors struggled to determine which charges would be most appropriate for grown-ups who genuinely believed they were following divine commands instead of committing crimes against their children. The religious part of the case created additional complications because the family's practices were presented as sincere religious beliefs instead of planned criminal activity. DNA testing became essential for proving the true parentage of the 12 children and documenting the extent of gene overlap that had created their problems. But even this scientific evidence was challenged by the family's religious beliefs, with all 4 grown-ups insisting that God rather than genes determined their children's characteristics. and that DNA testing represented faithless interference with divine will. The results of gene analysis showed patterns of marrying family members so extreme that they challenged scientific understanding of the minimum gene diversity needed for human reproduction. Mental health evaluations of the family members showed the deep psychological damage that had resulted from many years of isolation and religious teaching. The grown-ups showed signs of false beliefs and inability to tell the difference between their religious beliefs and real life. The children showed varying degrees of trauma from their development that went far beyond their gene problems, to include emotional and psychological damage caused by their complete separation from normal human society. As the investigation grew, authorities realized they were dealing with not just a case of child abuse, but a planned experiment in human gene manipulation that had been conducted without any understanding of the scientific rules involved or consideration for the well-being of the children who served as unwilling subjects in their parents' religious obsessions. The medical evaluation of the Coleman family began within 72 hours of their discovery and quickly became the most complete gene assessment ever conducted on a single family in Kentucky medical history. Dr. Patricia Morrison led a team of specialists who documented 43 different gene problems across the 12 children, ranging from fairly small learning problems to terrible organ problems that threatened immediate survival. The medical team's first report described the family as a living laboratory of family member breeding problems, with gene damage so planned and severe that it challenged basic ideas about the limits of what a human body could recover from. Each child needed immediate medical help for conditions that had gone untreated for years, while the family relied on prayer and plant remedies. The legal proceedings against James, Daniel, Sarah, and Mary Beth Coleman began with charges of child abuse, neglect, and marrying family members, but prosecutors quickly discovered that Kentucky's legal system was not good enough for addressing planned breeding programs conducted under religious justification. The four grown-ups genuinely believed they had been following divine commands instead of committing crimes, creating complex questions about criminal intent and religious freedom that had never been tested in court. Defense lawyers argued that their clients were victims of religious teaching instead of criminal masterminds, while prosecutors maintained that the planned nature of the abuse showed planned actions regardless of religious reason. The process of removing the children from the compound proved to be one of the most challenging parts of the intervention, because the family had been taught to view any outside interference as religious persecution. The older children, who could understand what was happening, cried and begged to remain with their family, genuinely believing that separation from their parents would result in spiritual contamination and eternal punishment. Helpers had to physically separate children from grown-ups who clung to each other while praying for God's help to prevent what they saw as the destruction of their holy family structure. Finding appropriate places for 12 very disabled children became an immediate crisis, because Kentucky's foster care system was not set up to handle the specialized medical and educational needs that resulted from their gene conditions and complete isolation from normal society. Many of the children needed constant medical supervision, specialized equipment for moving around and communicating, and therapy that went far beyond what typical foster families could provide. The state was forced to place most of the children in special care facilities that could address their medical needs, but offered little hope for the kind of individual attention and family bonding that might have helped them recover from their traumatic backgrounds. The psychological evaluation of the family showed the deep challenge of treating victims who had been systematically taught to protect their abusers and interpret intervention as proof of spiritual attack instead of rescue. The children showed classic signs of Stockholm Syndrome, defending their parents' actions and expressing genuine fear of being corrupted by contact with the outside world. Therapists struggled to help children understand concepts like normal family relationships and individual rights when their entire way of seeing the world had been built around shared family identity and religious duty to maintain gene purity. The medical treatment of the children's gene conditions proved only partly successful because many of the problems were irreversible results of damage during growth that had occurred while they were growing inside their mothers. Surgical operations could address some physical deformities and mechanical problems, but mental problems and brain damage could only be managed rather than cured. The children's complete lack of exposure to modern medical care meant that even regular procedures like vaccinations and dental work needed careful preparation and psychological support to prevent additional trauma. The legal resolution case took nearly 2 years and resulted in convictions for all 4 grown-ups on charges of child abuse and helping children do wrong. Though the marrying family members' charges were complicated by the family's sincere religious beliefs and the difficulty of proving criminal intent in cases involving planned teaching, James and Daniel received sentences of 15 years in prison, while Sarah and Mary Beth were sentenced to 10 years with the chance of getting out after serving 7 years if they completed psychological counseling and showed understanding of the harm their actions had caused to their children. The ethical questions raised by the Coleman case went far beyond the immediate legal issues to include basic questions about religious freedom, parents' rights, and the state's responsibility to protect children from parents whose sincere beliefs resulted in planned harm. Medical ethics experts debated whether the case represented criminal abuse or religious extremism taken to its logical end, while legal scholars struggled with the precedent of charging parents for practices they genuinely believed were ordered by God instead of chosen for personal enjoyment or planned cruelty. 21 years after their discovery, the Coleman children have become grown-ups whose lives serve as a permanent reminder of the terrible results of planned gene manipulation and religious extremism. The oldest survivors, now in their 20s, continue to struggle with the double burden of severe gene problems and psychological damage that has made fitting into normal society nearly impossible. Michael, the eldest, lives in a supervised group home where he receives help with basic daily tasks that his learning problems and movement problems make challenging. Despite years of therapy, he has never gotten past an elementary school level of thinking ability and needs constant supervision to handle even simple social interactions. The middle children, now teenagers, face even more severe challenges because their gene conditions were more extreme and their growth delays more serious. Several need full-time special care because their mental problems and physical deformities make living independently impossible. The youngest survivors show the most terrible effects of their parents' breeding program, with multiple children remaining in coma-like states or needing constant medical help to survive conditions that should have been fatal when they were babies. 3 of the original 12 children did not survive to adulthood, dying from organ failures and problems related to their gene problems. The psychological legacy of their upbringing has proven as difficult to address as their physical disabilities. Even after 2 decades of therapy, many of the survivors continue to struggle with ideas like individual identity and personal rights that conflict with the shared family beliefs they learned during their early years. They have difficulty forming relationships outside their sibling group and show constant worry about spiritual contamination from contact with people who don't share their gene heritage. Several still express loyalty to their imprisoned parents and interpret their current living situations as temporary exile rather than permanent rescue from an abusive environment. The broader impact of the Coleman case has influenced policy changes in child protective services and police training throughout Kentucky and neighboring states. Helpers now receive specialized training in recognizing signs of planned abuse in isolated religious communities, while medical professionals have developed protocols for identifying gene damage that suggests planned marrying of family members instead of random birth defects. The case has become a standard reference in gene counseling programs and police departments as an example of how religious extremism can create planned child abuse that operates outside normal detection systems. The scientific legacy of the Coleman family extends beyond their individual tragedy to contribute important data about the limits of human gene resilience. Researchers have studied DNA patterns to better understand how quickly gene diversity can be removed through planned marrying of family members, and what minimum levels of gene variation are needed for sustainable human reproduction. The family's gene profiles have become valuable resources for understanding inherited diseases and developing treatments for gene conditions that affect isolated populations around the world. The failure of social systems to detect and prevent the Coleman family's abuse has led to significant reforms in how authorities monitor isolated communities and respond to reports of unusual family structures. County social services departments now have protocols for conducting welfare checks in remote areas and training for recognizing signs of planned abuse that might be hidden behind religious justifications. School districts have improved their truancy investigation procedures to ensure that children who disappear from educational systems receive follow-up attention, rather than being written off as families who have moved away. The legal example set by the Coleman case has influenced how courts handle cases involving religious freedom and parental rights when children's well-being is at stake. The conviction of all 4 grown-ups established that sincere religious belief cannot be used as a defense for planned child abuse, regardless of how deeply held those beliefs might be, or how genuinely parents believe they are following divine commands. This example has been cited in subsequent cases involving religious communities where traditional practices conflict with child protection laws. The Coleman story serves as a permanent reminder that some of the most terrible forms of child abuse can occur in families where parents genuinely believe they are acting in their children's best interests. The planned nature of their gene manipulation demonstrates how religious extremism can create forms of harm that are more severe and long-lasting than impulsive acts of violence or neglect. Their case illustrates the critical importance of maintaining connections between isolated communities and mainstream society to prevent the development of closed systems where harmful practices can continue unchecked across multiple generations. The ongoing care requirements for the Coleman survivors represent a lifetime commitment from social services systems that must continue providing specialized medical therapeutic support for grown-ups whose gene conditions and psychological damage will never fully heal. Their story challenges society to develop better methods for detecting planned abuse in isolated communities while respecting legitimate religious diversity and family independence. The gene horror that began with William Coleman's messed-up religious vision continues to impact lives more than 2 decades after its discovery, serving as proof that some forms of child abuse create consequences that extend far beyond the immediate victims to affect entire communities and generations of families who must live with the results of planned cruelty disguised as divine devotion. But the Coleman family's nightmare isn't the only case of planned gene horror hidden in America's remote communities. Tomorrow, I'm taking you inside another family compound where religious extremism created an even more disturbing breeding program that lasted for over 60 years. What happens when a charismatic leader convinces 3 generations of women that bearing children to their own sons is the path to salvation? The medical evidence will make the Coleman case look like just the beginning. Make sure you like this video and follow the channel because tomorrow's story will expose gene manipulation so extreme that doctors still refuse to discuss the details publicly. Trust me, you're not prepared for what we're uncovering.